Awesome. Thank you, Ernie. So, hi everyone. I'm Audrey Hinkles. I'm a Salesforce administrator, developer, and project manager at Outbrain. And thank you so much for coming to my session today. Overcome your fear to become a Salesforce developer. Please make all purchasing decisions based on publicly available information. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit about my background. So I got my start on the Salesforce platform in 2011 when I joined a nonprofit called Grassroots Soccer. I went from there to a purpose-driven consulting firm called Vera Solutions, where I worked my way up to senior consultant and then technical support manager. I left Vera to pursue a master's of science in information systems and technology, and then moved to New York City and joined Outbrain in January 2017. So what is Outbrain? We are an Israeli startup that powers both internal publishers' recommendations and marketers' sponsored content. So if you're reading Outbrain on one of our partners, such as Wired, and you get to the bottom, you can see both other recommendations on Wired's site and external content, such as sponsored by Sprint, are powered through our algorithm. So in addition to running Sales and Service Cloud on our Salesforce platform, we also have many unique custom processes, such as content review, advertiser compliance, and fraud monitoring. So a little bit about my story. So why I wanted to become a Salesforce developer. So previously, when I was at Vera Solutions, I worked with developers. I wrote technical specifications. I managed them through a process. I tested their output. But when I joined Outbrain, a Salesforce customer that had lots of unique processes, I think when I joined, we had more than 15 Apex triggers, 40 Visualforce pages, 60 Apex classes. I realized that in order to support a customer like this, I would need to either forever be hiring developers or take the bold step to become one myself. So with that goal in mind, I had to figure out, what I wanted to ask Outbrain for. So the first place I went was Trailhead, and I also checked out some other online courses, such as through Pluralsight and Udemy, and I realized that a lot of those resources were geared at people who are just beginning to code almost in like an empty system. So it was how to add the first opportunity trigger in an org. That didn't really work for me because as I was going through and trying to decode the existing code that was in our system, I realized that I needed someone who could help me understand the existing code, figure out how I could add new functionality without breaking the existing things that had been added. And so in short, I needed a human. So I realized that I wanted a mentor who could come in person, look at the same computer screen as me, and work collaboratively with me to figure this out. So once I realized that this is what I wanted, I conducted some interviews. So I did in-person phone interviews, and then I brought candidates into our office, and I asked them to write a simple trigger and then explain what they had done line by line. I asked them questions about best practices and had them explain some of the concepts to me to find someone who not only was a strong Salesforce developer, but who was a good communicator, who was excited about the opportunity to kind of train and mentor somebody, and also wanted to work collaboratively with me. So once I found this person, I was then able to go back to my boss and then to their boss to kind of make this pitch that the company should invest in me. And I think having done all of this legwork made it easy for me to answer our CIO's questions and also made it easy for them to say yes. So I've included a slide here of actually from my original pitch that I did where I highlighted what I felt were the risks to our system to not developing this skill in-house. I kind of highlighted my willingness to learn and put in the extra time. And I emphasized some of our Outbrain's values in investing in professional development. And then I really thought that having this skill set would allow us to offer a better service to our users. So we wouldn't just be limited to making declarative or click-based changes, but actually programmatic, code-based as well. And I think that with all of these reasons, I was able to get the green light from Outbrain, which I'm very grateful for. So once I had the green light and I had the mentor, now I had to figure out how I was actually going to learn Salesforce development. So the first thing here was to understand where you actually code, learning some of the fundamentals and the terminology, working through multiple real-life projects from start to finish. So what I mean from this is, so as I was already working as a Salesforce administrator, so I was used to understanding, a business challenge, gathering requirements, designing a solution, building the solution, conducting user acceptance testing, deploying to production, and doing, supporting the rollout, and then doing training for users. So I wanted to do the same process, but for actually like Visualforce pages, Apex triggers, Apex classes that I was writing. And I think using this approach allowed me to understand, the entire life cycle, understand how to build test class coverage, and then was exciting because I could more immediately see the applications of the code that I was building. I'm going to show you the Apex language reference in just a second. And then I've listed Trailhead trail mix at the end. I think you can use Trailhead throughout the process, but I've kind of put it at the end because I think if you're focused only on what's relevant to your organization, if you wanted to, say, sit for the Certified Platform 1 developer credential, you may not have covered all of the elements that are necessary for that unless you look at one of the Trailhead modules. So from here, I'm actually going to jump into showing you a little bit of code. So 1 second. OK, so the first thing I had put in my plan of attack is where do you actually code? So this is Aside. It's a third-party web-based code editor. There are other ones you can use. There's Maven's Mate. There's Force.com, IDE. I think this allows you to have it's a little bit easier. It's like to code here. It provides like a better experience. And so there's a couple things I like about Aside. So the reserved words like public class, return are a different color, so they're in red, so you can usually see them. Internal comments are in green, so you can quickly see that that's not functional code, but it's an internal note to yourself or to future developers. And you can also, at the curly braces, actually collapse it, which this is a very short Apex class, but if it was much longer and you needed to isolate a particular section, you would be able to do that, and you can quickly, in one line, kind of copy it, which I think has been helpful. So this is an Apex class temperature converter. It's very basic. I just wanted to show an example. So it's expecting an input, a temperature in Fahrenheit, and then an output is that temperature, simple math, converting it to Celsius. So in addition to my Apex class, I have a test class. So this is temperature converter test. So I've named it very similar to the first Apex class so that if you're looking at an alphabetical list, you would be able to see it right below the temperature converter. So it's helpful to maybe you or future developers who are looking at your org. Many of you might have heard, what is test class coverage? You need to get 75% to be able to deploy. Essentially, you're coming up with example data that's testing what is in the Apex class to make sure that you've accounted for all the scenarios and enough of the lines of code are covered to be able to deploy. So in this example, I have test freezing point, so I'm giving an input of 32 Fahrenheit, and I have a system assert to expect 0 Celsius as the output. So in order to ensure that this actually is sufficient test class coverage, I would go back into Salesforce in a tool called the Developer Console. So I'm just going to quickly do that. Oops. And then I'll find the test class, so the temperature converter test. I'll click Run Test in the top right-hand corner. And then I'll open the original class that this is testing. And then I can see the overall test class coverage is actually 100%, and I can see broken down by each of the methods. So if there were lines that weren't covered, they would be highlighted in red instead of blue here. And so in this kind of simple scenario, it doesn't matter if the Fahrenheit is positive or negative number. The calculation to convert it to Celsius is the same. But if you can think of another example where a positive or a negative number you're expecting a different output, that's when it definitely makes sense to make sure that you have methods that are accounting for those positive and negative use cases. Awesome. So while I'm in the browser, I also just want to take a second to show you the Apex language reference that I mentioned in my climbing the mountain slide. So you can use this in kind of a couple different ways. It can be a bit like a textbook where you're treating it like a glossary, and so you're looking up different functions that you want to add. One other way to look at it is to kind of read it and pick out things that could be relevant for your organization. So one of the exercises my mentor gave me was, to go through some of it, for example, the math class, and then find functions that I thought were relevant and then practice using them. So I think that's like a cool other way to use these tools. It's not just a textbook, but you can also kind of, it's an important resource as well. Awesome. So I'm going to go back into PowerPoint now. Okay, so I've given you a lot of information. We've looked at a little bit of code. So now I just want to give you a quote by Alexander Petkov. So you don't have to know everything. You just need to know enough to be aware of how to find out what you don't know. I think that's really important. I think you're not going to learn how to code in a day, and it's important to remember that there are a lot of resources that you can use along in your journey. So there's a couple of resources I've listed here. Some of these you may already be familiar with. I want to call out a couple. So there's Code Clinic. This was started by a volunteer Salesforce developer in New York City, but it's open to anyone worldwide. You can actually submit your code for review by an expert, and you can sign up to be an observer as well. So you can listen in as like an experienced developer, advise as a company, and it's also a cool way, I think, to learn, other use cases that other companies are expanding the capabilities of Salesforce, through custom code. So that's definitely a cool one to look at. The Stack Exchange, so if many of you may be Salesforce administrators in the audience and you're kind of familiar with some of the resources where you can post if you're having trouble with the right syntax of a formula, you can get help in that way. There's kind of a similar page for developers, the Stack Exchange page within Salesforce. So again, you can both kind of read through some of the examples, you can post something, you can search for any questions you may have, and I think it's also can be fun to look at, and as you're learning, you realize maybe you can actually answer some of the questions that people are having, so it's a great resource as well. And then finally, I've listed Trailhead again. I have kind of this screenshot from the Prepare for Your Salesforce Platform Developer 1 credential. So I think I've included it here just because they kind of estimate that it takes 67.5 hours. I think it actually takes more than that, but it's a good kind of benchmark to keep in mind because it is a bit of a process. Cool. So I just wanted to call out a couple of myths and truths about development. So the first one, I think people are worried you must have, you have to study computer science or you have to attend a coding boot camp to be able to be a Salesforce developer. So I definitely don't think that's true. And I think it's important to remember, many of you in the audience may be Salesforce business analysts, Salesforce administrators. You're already familiar with the platform, but you're also familiar, I think, hopefully with a little bit of the business side of things. And so I think it's important to remember what you're bringing to the table as well. So you may not have written code in the past, but maybe you've gone through the process of understanding the business value, gathering the requirements, actually implementing a solution on the admin side. And I think the process isn't that different on the developer side. And it's important to remember that you're kind of, know what you're already bringing to the table. So there's too much to learn, so you don't have to know everything at once. There are a lot of great resources that are out there, and it's important to remember that there's also a lot of people that are willing to help you. So one of the great things about working on the Salesforce platform is the community is amazing. It's possible to find a mentor. It's possible to find people like the Code Clinic who are volunteering their time to teach you how to learn, and it's great to take advantage of those resources. And then finally, there are these learn to code in a day camps. If it's that easy, how come I'm struggling? I think a lot of times those camps are more aimed at getting people excited about learning code or giving them the fundamentals or the tools. But I think that learning to code is really like learning a language. You need to be practicing it regularly to be able to, otherwise you're kind of looking up every single line as you're writing, and it's very challenging. So it is important to remember that as well. So it does kind of take time and practice, but I have faith. I think that the fact that you have attended this session means that you're interested and exciting, and I hope you can go from here and maybe think about how you could apply some of these lessons. And I hope that, when I am a more experienced developer, I can play the role of a mentor for somebody as well. So thank you so much. I'd love to hear any questions.
Any questions? We have about 3 minutes. By the way, it took her what took me 30 years to do. I mean, so it's just pretty amazing that she did it so quick. And she can be a great mentor to whoever needs to learn. You had a question?
Thanks. I consider myself maybe a cut and paste developer, so I can find somebody else's code and cut and paste it and then configure it, sort of. Is that sort of dangerous? Or do you recommend to kind of abandon that and really kind of go towards your methodology?
Sure. So that's a good question. I think it depends exactly what your goal is. I think if you really want to become like an experienced developer, you would kind of need to go back to the fundamentals a little bit to really make sure you understand what's happening. Because I think if you're kind of cutting and pasting without having the understanding, you're still limiting yourself, because then what if you want to make a change to that piece of code, but you're not sure exactly how to do that? I think that could definitely be a challenge. But I think it depends what you're interested in. It's definitely one way to start. I started that way a little bit, but then quickly ran into, we had a lot of existing code. So how do I put what I'm copying and pasting into our existing code without breaking that functionality? And that's where I started to get concerned and felt like I needed more expertise to help me understand what was written and how to make those changes.
Any other question back there? This is good for my diet.
Hi, I'm curious, what is a good example for like a developer? So I'm an admin, I'm interested in looking into this, but thus far I've been able to solve most of my problems with like administrative solutions. What's a good example of a problem that would be a good like introductory problem that you would need to use Apex for?
Sure. So one example that we've encountered at our org is we have a custom object for surveys, and they're coming in, and there's a unique identifier attributed to it. And I want, as the record is being created, I want to find a record of another object that has that same ID and link it to it. And I'm able to do that. It's a lookup relationship, and so that's one use case where you, I believe, need to use an Apex trigger. And so that was the example that I gave for when I was like interviewing candidates, and then I kind of pressed them to make sure that they were following best practices, like making sure the code was bulkified. So it's easy to write code that works if one record is inserted, but what happens if you have 200 records inserted at once? How are you making sure that the code is able to handle that without running into limits within your system?
I think we're out 20 seconds, so please give her great feedback when you guys get from the app. Thank you.
Awesome. And my email was on that first slide, so if anyone has any questions or want to continue the conversation, I'm definitely open for that. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.